Hello everyone. So for this video, I want to teach you something or go over something that will kind of help you hopefully going forward with any rig that you work with. And it's to just briefly go over how to tell what a particular control does or what a particular property on a control does, right? Because unless you are the one rigging your own stuff, you may not know. If you work for a major studio as an animator, then you might be the one dictating some of what needs to happen. But until that point, as long as you are students or working freelance, you will probably be downloading rigs, and you'll have to figure out what is going on in these things, and learning that will in turn tell you, what you would want to ask for in a rig in the future if you worked with someone. Um, so step one to figuring out a rig and its controls for me is always, can I use a manipulator? Can I use a move tool or a rotate tool? That's almost exclusively going to be these two. Scale is very rarely, except for the main control. Scale is very rarely going to come into play. And I usually start with rotate because so much of what goes on in a rig is rotate. So can we actually use a rotate tool to move something around? Is that part of the equation here? And of course, for most of the things on here, yes, there are rotations that you can move, that you can change, and you change them pretty directly. Occasionally, there is also a translate, so is it one, is it both? So for example, most of the stuff on the back is only rotations. The shoulders and even this particular shoulder, only rotations. The hand, only rotations. Everything to do with the arms and upper back and neck is only rotations. Which is telling us that there's, with one exception of this, we'll get to in a second. So that's telling you that there's a certain limit to what's going on here. It tells us that it's using forward kinematics, FK. And then we get down to the hips, and it is expected that you would be able to both move and rotate the hips. Now, in this case, you can do it for both sets of hip joints. And that also tells me then that I should test this. If I see two hip controls, which I normally would, and I see that I can rotate both and move both, well, then I'm going to sit back here for a moment and go, well, which does what? And I see, okay, this is controlling just the interior here. And then this is controlling the whole thing. And I would kind of go through like that to work out what's happening. If I click on something like these arrows that are behind things, no manipulator is going to work on those. The same with certain parts of the foot joint back here. So these controls are doing something else. There are also controls that have your translates and rotates, but also other stuff. We will get to those. But step one is, can I use a manipulator? Step 1A is, all right, if I can use a manipulator, can I use it on all the things? And so we always have our channel box open and we look to see, nope, in fact, we cannot rotate the elbow, along that particular axis, which tells me if I want to spin the arm a certain way, it's expecting me to do it either from the wrist or from the shoulder, depending on what shape I'm looking for, what pose I'm looking for. So I would need to keep that in mind. Yes, I do know that in real life, our arms, if you were to look at them, they don't twist from here at the wrist, they twist from here. And a lot of rigs will incorporate that. So they will have motion over here as you twist the wrist. Because this is, oh, actually, wait. It is a little bit there. It's hard to see. Check it out though. Watch this shape right here as I spin this. There's a little bit of a twist on here. It's because your radius and ulna actually twist around each other, starting from this point, ending here. So it's not inaccurate to have the control here as long as the stuff is moving a little bit. But there's not going to be any control for that up at the elbow, right? And the channel box tells us this. If you have a rig, if you've downloaded what you think might be a good free rig, and you see all sorts of rotations available at the elbow, and you spin this and this part isn't moving, well, you maybe don't have the best rig. So yeah, that's step one, are the manipulators. Step 1A, are there things that are being limited so that we can only rotate certain things or only translate certain things. That's less common. Step 1B, are those rotation points actually on the rig itself, or are they removed somehow from the rig itself, or where the control would be? So, the elbow control, it's literally just right there. Same with the wrist, although it is moving this a little bit. The shoulder, all these things, the pivot point is within the model pretty closely. It might be somewhat removed from the control, but it's sitting what is probably on a joint. So there are joints in there, and that's what's rotating. Sometimes that's not the case though. So the feet in here, I don't know that there's a joint directly under this pivot point. You can see where there's a ball right here, and it feels like that's where the joint would be. And there's several other places where we can rotate around the foot. So this is a good one to study before you really put it to use. Where's it's rotating around like the back of the ankle. So that's not as hyperintuitive as, say, the elbow and the shoulder, where it's literally rotating directly around here. So that's something that you would want to look out for. Also, something like these where their translates, not rotates, but the pivot point is actually on the control, which is totally removed from the body. So I look at this and I say, okay, this is doing something else. Now I happen to know these are pole vectors, which means I know that the IK points to the joint. But even if I didn't necessarily know that, the fact that the controller is off the body, as is the pivot point for the controller, that tells me something to look out for, combined with the fact that it's, moving and not rotating. So these are things to be wary of. I would then also test, if I move stuff, which things follow. These follow. The foot controls follow. These don't. So that's step 1. Step 2, you will sometimes have control, you sometimes have extra properties, right? So all these controllers are they're taking away certain properties. There's no translate here, there's no scale here, because there shouldn't be. But does a controller have extra properties in the channel box? And of course, the feet almost always do. I can tell you also that the shoulder joints have something else. And so what are these things for, right? And so how do we discern what these are doing besides just the names? Eventually you'll get used to some of the names, although honestly these are a little bit different than what I'm used to. I could potentially figure them out. So I start changing numbers, and I look at what happens when I do, not just in here, but in the numbers. And so, for example, the foot tilt, this thing that goes back and forth, if I push it to its limit, it's 10 and -10. And it turns out that's the same for all of these. And so that tells me a little bit about how it was made. In this case, I'm pretty sure it's what's called a set-driven keys, which means you basically set up a path of animation. You set up a whole bunch, whatever locators in here need to rotate this way and that way, and you set the extreme over here at -10 and the other extreme over here at 10, and it technically it takes whatever those rotations are and it maps them out onto this control. And so you limit, okay, you say for whatever reason, this is the furthest out this can go, which it does look kind of broken there, but you can imagine it would not be if the leg was out this way, right? So they've animated the furthest rotation in either direction and then called that -10. They've called this area +10. They can turn it up to 11 if they want to, but the rotations themselves will be the same. And so they've remapped a whole bunch of rotations onto this -10 to 10 scale. That is also very common in rigs for foot things, but for other things as well. So you will see. Let's see. Nope, that's just rotations. Any of these things, the most. Oh, okay. So this one goes further. This one doesn't have the limits on it that the other ones do. All the rest of them, though, have the -10, +10 limit. Standard operating procedure for rigs. So that tells me, again, they have designed a set of animation to go from most tilted in one direction to most tilted in the other direction. 0 is always like your starting point, your neutral point. And you're not meant to go beyond that. So that's how I can tell with those. Now this one right here, the fact that it isn't constrained tells me that it's maybe a little bit, there we go. That kind of tells me why. So depending on where you put the foot and how you have the ankle bent, I mean, it's a little bit silly that it can go all the way around, but it's a lot harder to know where the limit would be, especially if you have a character that's being particularly flexible. So they've decided not to limit that. They've decided to say, okay, animator, that's on you to know the limits on, and so you don't necessarily rely on that. There are other types of ways the numbers might go on the property on these properties, and one of them that you see for both the stretch, actually no, that's a lie. The knee, yeah, okay, so the knee lock over here and the shoulder orient over here, you'll see that they're a binary set. It's either 0 or 1, and there's no in between. And you'll also see it for turning things from FK to IK, FK, IK. And since there is no in between, that tells me this is that's a switch of some sort. If you have any property in here that just goes 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, it's not really an animating thing. Like you're not sliding from point A to point B. It's turning certain controls on and off. It's a way of editing your rig. It's not unlike this right here where I said, okay, this is about placing it. But once you place it, you don't animate using this control. These switches are similar. You either have an IK leg or an FK leg. You're not going to be switching between both usually. You're not usually going to be switching between both in the middle of a shot. The knee lock that's over here has to do with if it's actually pointing towards the pole vector or if it's automatically locked onto the pole vector. That is a preference that some people have for their pole vectors. I prefer pointing at stuff, so that I would have the knee lock turned to 0. I'd have it turned off. Perhaps if you were using very stretchy IK, you might turn that on so that you could more directly point your knees certain ways. But again, this is something that you set up beforehand. You choose the type of arms you're going to use. You choose the type of pole vector you're going to use. You choose the type of, stretch you're going to have going on. And then you turn these things on and off. In particular, the one on the shoulder, since I'm not the one that built this, I'm not entirely sure why they have this difference, but some people have already run into it in class, or they will go to animate and they'll accidentally, change this, and then suddenly it's like the arm changes where it is a little bit, and then the direction that these things was working in was getting a little bit funny, and there was like kind of a knock-on effect where if you changed one thing, they all changed. I do have an educated guess though. So I said in class that we have rotation orders for these joints. So it would go, I think it would calculate Z and then Y and then X, which is technically something you can change in Maya. There is a rotation order somewhere in the preferences. So it's under settings and animation. Please do not mess with this like accidentally. But you can see there's these different versions of how it's going to calculate the rotations, and you shouldn't really mess with that unless you absolutely know what you're doing. But what can happen is you get something called gimbal lock. So gimbal lock is when you're in the middle of animating and you're really wildly using the shoulders and you've got all sorts of stuff going on, and then like suddenly of course I'm not gonna be able to break it when I want to, but sometimes you'll find yourself that you can't rotate it any further. Or you'll go into animation and it will not interpolate the way you want it to. If you have very broad motions with the shoulders, you will often not be able to get it to move from point A to point B the way you want. And that's running into gimbal lock. And so sometimes you'll have like one shoulder joint and then also another one in the exact same location so that you can kind of try a different rotation order. So without having any ability to look under the hood at how he built this, that is my guess, is that there's two different sets of rotation orders that you can use to get your animation. Again, I would not switch between these midstream, but that is the kind of thing we need to watch out for in animation. The easier fix, if you're animating and the shoulder gets a little wacky, is to just dial it back a little bit. And also remember that you have the shoulder blade that you are also supposed to be using. And also remember that if someone's shoulders are spinning wildly, they should probably be rotating their body. So you can have the body rotate in this direction to get the arm quite a ways to where you want it to go. And also, by the way, we've got, you know, other joints in the back that we can spin as well. So you can get a lot of the rotation done using the other joints. So shoulder blade or clavicle, as they call it in here. You know, the back joints. There is also on this one this overall joint. So there's a lot of options if you run into that gimbal lock. So we have things that go, you know, 360 degrees like we're used to. The translates have numbers that are just wherever the coordinate system is. We have some properties that go from -10 to +10 because they've been designed. The animation has been set up to do that. And we have some things that switch on and off between A and B. Slightly in the middle of the last two ones, there are a few that, so stretch right here is whether or not the IK is going to stretch. Actually, let's do it for here. Whether or not this leg is going to stretch as it moves. So right now, what happens is if I move this, the knee locks, the controller will still move. If I turn on the stretch, it determines how much the legs will stretch to reach the controller. Now, if you turn it all the way to 1, then it becomes very stretchy. And I wonder where my controller went. There it is. And it'll, once it's done, once you bend the knee, it's unstretched. But then when we do this, there we go. And it can wildly stretch all over the place. Now we can also tamp that down. So it's a switch. It goes from non-stretchy to stretchy, but you can also say like mildly stretchy with 0.2. And what happens is it doesn't stop the controller from going very far away, and technically it still keeps stretching, but you'll see where it's kind of like, oh, it's a little bit of a stretch, right? Versus like, oh, now we're just breaking it. There's kind of a point at which it doesn't really function how it's supposed to anymore. And you can see that in your eyes. You can tell where that happens. So it's a switch, but it's like a dimmer switch that you can use, you know, with caution. There was one other control. Last but not least, kind of going back to the beginning, this controller is a little bit unique. It is a squash and stretch controller that you use the manipulator for. So most of the rest of the stuff is pretty direct. We move these to point them, or we move the feet to point them. Everything else is rotations. This is one exception. It's almost definitely using some kind of IK. Oh yeah, there we go. Bony spine top IK shape. So it's using an IK handle for the back, which means instead of, you know, rotating this and rotating this and then rotating that, you just rotate the whole thing at the top. But it's allowed to exist at the same time as these things. And that's because its main purpose does seem to be adding a bit of squash and stretch, which is one of the, this is what makes this a relatively refined rig, that you can have both those types. You can have your cake and eat it too. You can control the back very, very directly while still having, you know, this squash and stretch and this IK look. I know I said in class that I personally would leave the rotations up to the back controls and be able to control them directly. Yeah, that means there's 3 of them plus the neck. So I like having that kind of control. And I would use this simply for, you know, the squash and stretch as the character's moving, or oh, we're stretching up as we walk, something like that. I would probably use it very subtly because this character is the head's a little cartoony, it's a little big, but this is still relatively human proportions. So we don't need to like Snow White and the Seven Dwarves this with the amount of squash and stretch. Right? So this control is a little bit unique. It does have the pivot point right in the center, but it's controlling an IK. It's more like this than the other controls in the upper body, right? It's, whoops, that's because my pull vector is, there we go. It's doing what this is doing, but for the upper body. All right, so I hope that information helps you kind of decipher not only this rig, but rigs going forward. But those are the things we watch out for. Where the manipulator, can I use a manipulator at all? Where are they located? Like for their pivot points, what are the numbers that are changing? If I have added, properties, how do those numbers change? Are they binary switches? Are they gradient switches? Or are they set animation curves where someone has designed the animation curve and I'm simply sliding along that curve. And none of these are better or worse than the rest. They're just different tools for different scenarios. And we just want to use them appropriately.